Hi folks, Michael Camp here. It's time for Religious Fact Check number 4. No, contrary to popular theology, Jesus did not teach the doctrine of hell. So this one is really critical because if you get this wrong, then it really messes with your mind. It causes cognitive dissonance and unnecessary religious trauma and fear. Sadly, evangelicalism, fundamentalism, and Catholicism have all used the threat of hell to do this. Especially vulnerable are children, youth, and anyone who's caught in a fear-based faith. Now, there are a lot of good books out there that debunk hell, and at the end of the video, I'll share a list with you. And this video, of course, won't cover everything, but it will be a good start. Okay, there's basically 5 reasons that show us that Jesus did not teach the doctrine of hell. Number 1, a good study of history shows us that the doctrine of hell did not come from the Old or the New Testaments. Its origins were outside of Judaism and didn't seep into Judaism until during and after the Babylonian captivity. And as far as Christianity, its origins were outside Christianity until the centuries after Jesus, when it seeped in. So the Old Testament did not teach it, nor the New Testament, as we will see. So number 2 is that historians believe that the doctrine of hell, which let's define it as anyone who's not good enough or saved, goes to eternal punishment in the afterlife. But they believe that the doctrine came from Persia, Egypt, and in particular Zoroastrianism, which was a religion of Persia and Iran. And historians have found records that show that the religious and political leaders created the doctrine to control the multitudes of people and to put fear in their hearts of the invisible world. So number 3 is that the first time that the Jewish people began writing about the doctrine of hell was during the Intertestamental period, that is, between the Old Testament and the New Testament time. They wrote books like First Enoch and Ezra, that was written by the Essenes. Now, that's a different Ezra from the Old Testament Ezra. And those books taught the doctrine of hell. But those books were never finally accepted into the Old Testament canon, and Jesus never acknowledged those books. And because of those books and some of the mistranslations that started to happen in the New Testament, which we'll talk about next, so because of those things, later on in the 4th century, people like Augustine began to teach the existence of hell for non-believers. So number 4 is the mistranslations that we can find in both the Old and New Testament for the terms hell and eternal punishment. So there's several terms that we want to go through. First of all is the term Sheol, and that's in the Old Testament in Hebrew, and that means the place of the afterlife for both the righteous and the unrighteous. There was no differentiation between heaven and hell. That word, often translated hell, should really be translated something like grave. The other term is Hades, which is just the Greek version of Sheol, and again, that should not be translated hell. It should be translated something like grave. The other term that was very common in the New Testament was the term Gehenna. And Gehenna was actually literally the garbage dump outside Jerusalem. And it has a history. The prophet Jeremiah used the term when he was warning the Israelites, if you continue on in your violent and evil ways, your enemies will come and destroy you and literally throw your bodies into the garbage dump outside Jerusalem. Jesus came along and used that term the same way. It's like a metaphor for judgment. It's for a warning for the here and now, not for the afterlife. And so Jesus was saying that if you continued on your violent ways, the Romans would come and throw your bodies in Gehenna, and using that same metaphor that people were familiar with. So that's actually pretty much what happened. In 70 CE, there was a violent Jewish uprising in the late 60s, and by 70 CE, the Romans had come in to quash this uprising, and they destroyed Jerusalem and the temple, and most likely threw bodies in the garbage dump outside Jerusalem, because that's what they did, after a battle. So that's the story of Gehenna. So the next term is the term eternal punishment, which occurs in the New Testament. And the Greek for that is aionios kolasis. And those terms actually should be translated something like the chastening of the age, or the rehabilitation for a set period of time. Because the word eternal or aionios doesn't mean forever or eternal. It actually means pertaining to an age. And also the word kolasis, the word for punishment, is not a punitive measure. It's a corrective measure that's meant to rehabilitate someone, to restore them. So when those terms are correctly translated, they're not talking about hell or eternal punishment. So the last word that was mistranslated as hell was the word Tartarus. And that occurs in the book of 2 Peter. And it's generally an alternative word for the term Hades. It's part of Hades. It's from Greek mythology. So that's just mistranslated. It's also important to note that Jesus never used that word. Jesus used the words Hades, Gehenna, and aionios kolasis. So he didn't use that word, Tartarus. So also that is from the book of 2 Peter. And 2 Peter is actually the most disputed book in the New Testament when it comes to authorship. And so most likely Peter was not even the author of that book. So those are the 5 terms that are mistranslated in most English Bibles, mistranslated as hell or eternal punishment. So number 5 is that Universalism, which can be defined as the belief that all will be reconciled to God ultimately. Universalism was actually the prevailing view of the early Jesus movement for its first 400 or 500 years. The only major church father that believed in the doctrine of hell and taught it was Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th century. All the other church fathers, or most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, like Clement, Origen, Gregory of Nyssa, Nestorius, Theodore, and others, taught what's called universal reconciliation, not the doctrine of hell. So those are the 5 reasons we know that Jesus didn't teach the doctrine. And we know that he taught people who are lost would be held accountable, but that they would be restored, they would be rehabilitated in some process. He did not teach the doctrine of hell. He taught God loved his enemies, and God would love his enemies even in the afterlife. So any judgment that Jesus referred to was either in the here and now or some kind of time-limited rehabilitation, not some eternal dungeon. So make sure you see the list at the end of this video of resources, and thanks for listening. And if you like these religious fact checks, please subscribe.